Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Meet the Analyst webinar, the 3 A's of advertising: addressability, attention metrics, and AI. I'm your host, Evelyn Mitchell-Wolf, Senior Analyst at Insider Intelligence, and I'm joined by a very special panel today. I'd like to welcome Amy Owen, U.S. Head of Commerce at Angelina Ang, Vice President of Measurability, Addressability, and Data Center at the Interactive Advertising Bureau, Ian Anderson, Vice President of AI at InMobi, and Todd Rose, Senior Vice President of Global Business Development and Addressability at InMobi. It's wonderful to have you all here.
Thank you for having us. I'm glad to be here.
Same here.
Thank you.
Excellent. Before we get into our discussion, I'd like to thank InMobi for making today's webinar possible. And a few things before we dive in. While I have questions of my own planned, this is also an opportunity for you to ask your burning questions. We're here to tackle them. So just use the chat window at the right of this video feed to submit them at any time, and we'll get to as many as we can. There's also no need to take notes if you would rather not, because we will email you a link to view the full recording of today's discussion. Now let's get started. I would like to kick things off with one of the most buzzy topics of the moment, which would be, of course, AI. And there's been a lot of talk about what marketers are able to do or will be able to do with AI in the future. But what can marketers do with AI, right now? What areas should they be focusing on at the moment?
Thank you so much. So it's been such an incredible time. If you think what happened last year in sort of like November time, when we had the explosion of ChatGPT, and what this suddenly made people realize is how real AI was and how useful it was. And it kind of democratized access because suddenly everyone could kind of log in and use this tool. And you were seeing all of these people sort of like sending and sharing kind of information. Oh, look what happened here. And then we see like a flurry of startups kind of get created from this. And there's so many sort of different areas and kind of applications. But it's almost like with this kind of the imagination is really kind of the limit. But I think for me, one of the two things that kind of happened is in the past, companies' kind of budgets were sort of devoted more towards the people building AI systems. And now pretty much anyone can kind of like create AI systems on top of the underlying services from the likes of kind of OpenAI. So if we think about like how you might go about kind of creating like a creative, which you want to kind of use for some campaign, suddenly you can create a ton of different kind of variations. And then you could actually throw this out and do some kind of A/B testing to kind of find what is working for you. And you can use this kind of like right now. We're also seeing use cases where people can sort of like log into these tools and say, hey, I've got this campaign brief. What segment should I be kind of buying against? What should I target and why? And you'll get this kind of interesting kind of pushback where you might want to kind of, you're targeting something for families, but actually you might get this point to say, hey, you should also be looking at maybe grandparents as a segment because of the care of the kind of the children goes to these kind of extended families. So just overall, I would really kind of encourage people not to kind of be nervous, but to try and get out there and play and experiment with some of these services themselves, because it's just such an accessible time. And there are so many different startups that can kind of assist you with your goals here.
Yeah, I'd love to add that, and this has been a very hot topic here at the IAB around how AI is currently being used and what the potential opportunities are. I'm really excited on the data and measurement side of things, where there are add-ins or opportunities to upload a set of data and it providing automatically creating Excel charts or pie charts or PowerPoint presentations, and then giving a brief overview or insight into what the data looks like. And I think there's, from the future standpoint, the ability to have the AI look at trends that may not be so apparent to the human eye. And I think that's pretty powerful. We had, and then on the flip side, we're seeing a lot of companies start looking at AI to look at their own content and being able to bubble it up to consumers, so that when there is the term where how do you trust that the content that is being provided, is there misinformation or disinformation in it? So a lot of publishers are starting to take it in their own hands to apply that AI on top of their own content, because they have the reputation and the authors and writers in their network, and be able to bubble that up in a search result for consumers when they do so. So there's a couple of publishers already starting to take advantage of AI in that aspect.
I think when we talk about AI,
sorry, Todd, you go ahead.
No worries. I think when we talk about AI, what most the average person is really referring to is generative AI, right? We don't talk about that first part of it, but when you are exposed to DALL-E or to ChatGPT, it's that generative AI, and the standard use case that I think most people are thinking about in advertising is development of creative or marketing messaging with the assistance of AI. I get really interested and excited about sort of the next frontier, I guess, which is more almost evaluative AI, using AI for determining what audiences or what campaigns to surface for a given ad impression, for platforms to be able to shape traffic and more efficiently send to buyers most likely to find an impression of interest. So I think that's the next iteration of use cases we'll see beyond the obvious ones that the public is largely focused on.
And I think from my perspective, being on the agency side, I see the world of consumers, and I also see our internal world, right? So I love the idea of AI just because we've been doing everything manually in the space for so long. And so retail is my background, Excel's, writing things down, doing all of the work that is expected of us was tiresome, and it was a lot of hours. And so even taking the simplicity of automating something on the back end is really helping us drive results faster for our clients and making things easier for us, or what I say simplification. And then when you look at the consumer side, like that's like what they're expecting as well. And I mean, I say this a lot, but I love the merge of data tech and retail media from my perspective, because it's just making things simpler for everybody, but it also expedites it immensely. And so it's an interesting space. We've had many conversations around this topic, and it's changing. It's changed since the last time we spoke about it, and that was about 3 months ago. So I'm super excited how we're using it today to really inform our processes and to expedite them to drive that greater result.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, have you started to see that kind of return on the time that it is yeah, you have? Because I know, I mean, in my personal experience with AI, sometimes there's just a little bit of a curve where the time it takes to learn the tool, get really good at understanding the ways that it can enhance your workflows. Sometimes there's more work that has to be done before it really starts to iron out and then show dividends on the time investment. But if you're already there, that's excellent.
We're seeing that, and we're also seeing I'll call it like the elimination, for lack of a better term, of the human error too. And so I know that there's always a balance of art and science, right? And so you're always going to double check the work of the machine and put like your spin on it to understand what you're delivering is the most efficient based on a relationship you're having with, again, in my retailer realm. But having someone go through an Excel and have thousands and thousands of lines to prove out a sufficiency for, search or programmatic or whatever it may be on a retailer site is not only cumbersome, like you had mentioned, with the hours, but it's also eliminating a lot of that error that coincidentally, when you're staring at something for so long, like you're going to have that regardless.
Yeah, Excel sheets they have a way of kind of playing tricks with your eyes sometimes when they're big.
I'm still friends with them. Like we still use them, but yeah. we're not spending as much time.
I know that so about 2 years ago we had published a paper around artificial intelligence and the different marketing use cases. And one of the gentlemen that helped write the paper was from Dentsu, and it was interesting. His main primary responsibility was to figure out how AI could help internally improve processes like traffic sheets. I mean, think about it from an ad ops standpoint or from an activation standpoint, when a lot of people are trying to rush to fill out RFPs and insertion orders. And there's typically a lot of errors in those sheets due to human error or the ability to reclassify something or rename something. So one of the things that he had done was do just that, was automate that process to actually QA a traffic sheet. And from my understanding, given that I came from ad ops world, a game changer.
Well, we love game changers around here. Go ahead.
Sorry. I just wanted to add that this point is sort of like spot on, because some of the really, really interesting things that have happened is that you've had this kind of transformation of your data analyst writing maybe some SQL style queries to interrogate some data. And then you've got this point where you can now ask these questions in free-form natural language, but not only is it doing that, you can actually kind of ask it to kind of compute some result. Then it's linking to this knowledge base, to this LLM, which is actually going to like sanity check the answer for you, even before you see it. Like an off-topic one, I asked for like the leading goal scorer for some football data set, some soccer data set in the UK. They came back and it was like, oh, this data suggests it's the goalkeeper, but we know the goalkeeper doesn't score goals. So therefore this must be wrong. So please look again. And it was just like, oh, wow, that was just incredible just to see this kind of joining up of this kind of like data analysis, but also with real world knowledge just by the power of LLMs.
Absolutely. Ian, I love how excited you are on AI. It's infectious. No, don't apologize. It's excellent. Moving along here, I want to kind of return to what Todd was getting at a little bit earlier. So generative AI and predictive analytics coming together to enhance or otherwise augment the targeting strategies that advertising content or that are applied to advertising content in a way that couldn't happen before. Let's go a little bit deeper and talk about exactly what kind of benefits that, I mean, it'd be great to hear what we were seeing now, but also in the future, when things kind of get a little bit more embedded in the system, where do we see things going with this?
So everyone knows what happened with Apple and the ATT prompt and how there is a loss of data signals when it comes to capturing or delivering ads to people on Apple iOS devices. So there's AI can actually help to fill in those gaps, right? So if there is certain data on, especially on the back end, right? So if you look at, if you're not able to deliver ads to Apple iOS users, if an advertiser is looking at their website and seeing what exactly audiences are, where they're clicking on, what their interests are, it can actually help fill in the gap and provide recommendations on exactly how to target Apple iOS users. And there's that missing attribution right now, because if someone opts out of ATT tracking, you can't actually figure out if they've converted or not. So AI is pretty powerful in looking at that data and then taking and looking at it and overlaying some of the probabilistic methodologies on top of it. And so I think that's really exciting. And at some point, really spitting back very specific recommendations of how to change out your media mix, as well as your channel investments.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, I think it's like spot on, because I think there's also this really interesting time now where, because potentially your cost of like developing a creative may be drastically different now because of generative AI, but equally that means you can kind of test more, so you can start to kind of personalize at kind of a different level. And so this kind of like feedback loop in terms of what is working and which one should be kind of dropped, to try and do this manually, it's just really not feasible at this type of scale. So you can have AI systems which can kind of basically be learning, oh, this is working really well, this one drop these ones kind of and raise that priority. But the other thing I will kind of call out is that because of this focus and this mind share of the kind of what's happened with generative AI, we've also seen an increase in AI budgets for non-generative AI use cases to do with these type of more traditional feedback loops. And so that greater investment is yielding kind of like a greater performance, and there is that kind of mind share around this. So it's a pretty wonderful time.
I think from my standpoint, the part that I'm most excited about is the curation development of that content and making it personal. We have a few pillars from a commerce perspective here at UM. And so one of them is commerce as content. And so how do you actually deliver something, build trust with that given shopper, the consumer, and then have them actually interact with your ad? There was an Instagram beta that we had worked with a third-party tech provider. And so ultimately it was a choose your own adventure. And so there was an ad, and then they said, do you want to hear more about the ad? Do you want to understand how to use the product? Do you want to understand where to buy it? And so even that helps us build specific consumer journeys for different audiences, and knowing how we start with usually audiences first and find out where their media is being consumed and also their behaviors helps us. So, to your point, it's exciting on that end as well, because it's helping us develop things and learn pieces that we might not have known if we're doing everything by ourselves.
Awesome. Well, I think we could probably keep talking about all of this for the entirety of the webinar, but I'd like to move on to our next A, which is attention metrics. I just actually published a report on attention metrics, so it's fresh on my mind. A lot going on in this space. But for the uninitiated, can we on this panel, maybe Angie, describe what attention metrics are and how they're measured?
Well, there is currently no standard definition for attention. And thank you for this, because this is one of the initiatives that I'm working on at IAB. We have a thing called the IAB Attention Task Force, and we look at it in three approaches. One is around biometric data, which includes neurological and physiological tracking or scanning of facial recognition, brain waves, heart rate, blood pressure, et cetera. So that's one way. And those typically require some sort of device to monitor. The second is around data signals, specifically proxy signals that are coming through the supply chain, either being sent through directly from a publisher, or being captured, or information that is being captured from the device. And so you can think about a lot of ad verification companies are doing just that. And most of the metrics that they measure is around ad engagement, behavior, et cetera. And then the third is around the cognitive and the emotional, where, how has an ad affected their mindset, or did it initiate or prompt a different consideration? So your brand health studies, your ad effectiveness studies fall in those three buckets. So I think of it in three different ways. I don't think there is one definition that all those different solution providers will agree on, although we will try. But I think it's important to understand the three different approaches, and there possibly could be more that that emerge. But right now, those are the three that are emerging, and we are working on providing some clarity and guidance around those three approaches.
And when we talk about the three components that Angelina brought up, none of them are new or groundbreaking in and of themselves. They've all been around in one form or another. What the industry hasn't done is, to Angelina's point, standardize on a way to aggregate those three sorts of metrics into one standard currency. So I think there's a lot of promise here, because the underlying technologies are familiar, they're developed. It's now a matter of repackaging them into one comprehensive, cohesive metric that advertisers and publishers can evaluate on an apples-to-apples basis across channels.
Yeah, it sounds like, though, there are, to Angie's point, without a common definition quite yet, there are a lot of questions to answer before we get to that point where it can be used as a currency. But there are still people kind of leaning into the attention metrics trend. Does anyone have a perspective they can lend on what adoption is looking like at an industry level?
Yeah, from my standpoint, it's small, but it's growing. And when you're talking about attention, to, like the panel's point, there is no third party that's coming out and saying, this is what attention looks like, this is how you measure it yet. And so it's the building the trust between us and clients and having a conversation on when do we want to implement something that involves attention metrics. What KPIs do you want to drive, what objectives, and when does it make sense for the given plan? So it's definitely something in my world where it's coming up, because when we're looking at audiences, specifically using first-party data from retailers, how awesome would it be that I'm targeting the Walmart shopper that shops the beauty product, but I actually know that they're responding to it. And so not to be the person that brings up the AI piece again, but then you're also driving the personalization with the content. And then that's when it gets really intriguing and interesting. And I hear, like, you know, the madness, Evelyn, of you pulling together the panel today, because all of the 3 A's are really interwoven with each other. But that's really like where I think the bread and butter will be for attention, is like really understanding what the AI piece is driving, and then what is really delivering from an efficiency play. So I'm eager to work with, wink, wink, a third party to get that out there, so then we could have that measurement in place and drive even further efficiencies with the advertising that we're working on behalf of our clients.
I do want to caution, though, and so I do want to caution the industry from rushing to make attention metrics a currency. There is a lot of things for us as a whole to consider, and we had this. You know, this is very reminiscent of the days of when viewability came out. But when we start thinking about attention, there are scholars, there's academia definitions of and scientific ways of measuring attention. Question is, are those can we measure it in a scalable fashion? Is their panel representative of the population as well as the publisher's audience? And then secondly is, what is the impact on revenue, scalability on the publisher side, and are we putting too much accountability on the publisher? And then I think thirdly, what is the role of creative? So not all creatives are equal. I've coming from an ad ops background, and I say this a lot, I've trafficked hundreds of thousands of ads and loved all my clients, but not every creative was awesome, right? So there are some that are really eye-catching, engaging, others that need to work a little bit harder to explain their story. And so I think there's something there that we need to take into consideration.
Just think in terms of when we start to look to the future for where this will kind of end up potentially. I think back to like context-aware computing. So some of my background research would, like, imagine you're walking down a road and you're sort of trying to see something on the screen and it's like just rendered in one form. Versus if you could transform that, if you knew that that person was kind of like doing that, you could increase the font size, you could change the kind of contrast ratio, all of these things could be kind of done in the future. And I think that ultimately we'll see that type of adaptive, because the attention is not the same basically in all contexts. And so that's very going to change for kind of individuals. So I think there's so much exciting work that's going to happen there in the future, given the, obviously all of this and the power of AI. So yeah, exciting.
Yeah, so we've got a long road ahead of us, it seems like, or at least, so Ian, that's your perspective, that there is a future in attention metrics. Why now, though? You know, attention metrics they're having a really hot moment. That's why they're on this list. And to Amy's point, yes, it's wink, wink. We did intend to talk about all three of these things together. But why attention? Why now? You know, are attention metrics simply having a moment, or will they fade into the background maybe once the industry settles into kind of a new post-cookie, post-mobile ad ID identity paradigm? Are there any additional kind of advertising use cases that are not going to be solved by these other solutions that the industry is working towards? It sounds like, Ian, there's certainly a use where we could optimize the experience of the user. But does anyone have any contradictory opinions on whether attention will survive past this current moment of uncertainty?
I think it's risen to the forefront for the same reasons that media mix modeling, MMM, has come to the fore relative to MTA, that loss of signal, right? There's fewer cross-publisher IDs available to tie ad exposures throughout the consumer journey to a conversion event. So you need something to replace that sort of ubiquitous measurement standard with something else to measure effectiveness of advertising. It's still a proxy. It's not as close to, it's not tying a hard conversion to exposures, but it's sort of the next best thing, or one of the next best things. So I think MMM and attention metrics together and other incrementality-based measurement paradigms will come increasingly into favor unless we see some, great reversal in the privacy ecosystem. And I don't think any of us are anticipating a backtrack anytime soon.
Yeah. I also feel that everything right now is being driven by the consumer. So I recently read a stat that the consumer's purchase cycle, depending on what it is, has dropped in a matter of seconds, right? So the average person used to purchase the beauty category in 7 seconds or less. Now it's 5 seconds. I'm sure other categories are a little bit different, but they're seeing a decline. So you're wanting to grab that attention as that consumer is driving the time spent with the ad. And then also understanding what they're doing. So that's kind of the purchase cycle. But then you also see on social media, the average person is in a deep scroll for over a mile a day. So it's where they are, how they're consuming, and what they're doing. And so I really think you have to keep an eye on the consumer. So yes, we can make all of these predictions, right? But what is the consumer doing, and how are they actually changing their media consumption behaviors? And that's where the data and technology advancement actually drives some of that as well, and how consumers are adapting to it. So I don't have a yes or no answer for you today, but I really feel like there's a lot of factors that go into how we could potentially see it come up and see it actually be established, or see it kind of go by the wayside, depending on how the consumers are actually engaging with ads.
But I do think that there is one of the major driving forces is around efficiency and the desire to make sure that advertising, there's minimal waste of impressions, which I think, again, we need to be very cautious because, I think panel size is really important to kind of really have deep conversations on in the methodologies. But at the same time, when you think about viewability, it was the opportunity for an ad to be seen, right? Or heard. And now we're moving into, is the publisher providing content enough to enable advertisers to deliver their message to an engaged consumer? So we're kind of bringing it much closer. We're bringing advertising, or the ads, much closer to gauging the validity of purchasing media on a specific publisher, which again, I think, is that the right thing to do? Many will argue that, hey, I have the audience, you guys have the ad, we're bringing them together, but for us to be accountable for making sure that that user is actually paying attention to the ad, that is a significant concern of publishers, that they could possibly drop off a buy, and most likely, and there's the opportunity for companies to actually game the system, making larger ad units on their website, and creating more content that is more controversial to allow people to actually stay on a particular page.
Yeah, so it's education goes along with standardization of how to use those metrics. And for the buy side, it's as much to evaluate the effectiveness of your creative as it is the channels that you are putting that creative on.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think any of us wants to end up in a future where we're kind of held captive to watch an ad for maximum attention, because that's the only way that the publisher can make money. But consumers, I'm sure, will get wise, and we'll start to see kind of new paradigms emerge around how to best ride the line between making sure you're maximizing attention for the sake of, changing the consumer's behavior or whatever the outcome is, while still making sure that there is that value exchange, that they're there willingly, so that you don't scare them off.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about AI, we've talked about attention metrics, and I'm sure both of those things will come up in our next A here. We're going to talk about addressability for a moment. So we are closing in on the 2024 deadline for the deprecation of third-party cookies in Chrome. I actually just put together a slide for a presentation I'm giving next week that has a timeline, and I put a little "you are here" arrow, and I was like, whew, that is sobering. So I'd love to kind of go around robin here and talk about whether we think the industry is ready. Google ad IDs will soon go the way of Apple's IDFA. Marketers will kind of be left without any of the identifiers that programmatic advertising was built upon. So is the industry ready for this?
I don't know if they're ready for it, but I think we're more prepared because it's been pushed off. So, like we've been talking about it for a few years. I know inside our walls, we've actually come up with solutions that combat the depreciation of cookies. And I know in my world specifically, I work with a lot of retail first-party data. So there may or may not be something there that is impacting me wholeheartedly. But I also know that people at some point or another, that they'll think that they're ready, but then when it actually hits, there are going to be other components and other dimensions that we haven't thought of. So I think that the education has been there, that we've personally been educating a lot of our clients on what's going to happen. Here are some of the processes we could take. This is what we've created. Here are the solutions. But until it actually hits, I don't know exactly if we're 100% prepared, but we're a lot more prepared than we were if it was going to be turned on within, like 2 months time or something along those lines when it was first announced.
I'll be more provocative and say no. Although for
you
many
took
of the
my
same
answer.
yeah, it's a different.
I'm just trying to be optimistic on a Thursday, guys.
But for many of the same reasons that Amy has talked about, it's just sort of a different take. Yes, I think there's a lot of preparation, a lot of education. We are certainly out there talking to our clients about the spectrum of solutions that will be available. But when you talk about industry readiness, we see a couple things that are happening. One is when IDs aren't available. Well, first of all, buyers are still buying against IDs, the way business, sort of business as usual, the way they've always done it. And when IDs aren't available, they sort of default to the least common denominator, contextual, because it's familiar, it's been there, but they're ignoring a whole range of solutions along the spectrum between those two endpoints, if you will. Modeled solutions, cohort-based solutions. There's a lot of education around them, but there hasn't been adoption until the other shoe drops and, the Google advertising ID and the third-party cookie in Chrome go away. So that's one of the sort of observations we've had. Another observation, I think, that tells me the industry isn't ready is the workarounds that we see folks still using. And I can say anecdotally, we see evidence of publishers inserting publisher-specific IDs into bid requests in place of traditional mates. So they're trying to insert signal, give buyers something to build a profile around. Even though it's not cross-publisher, it'll be somewhat limited. It's a bit of a workaround on the path to adoption of these other solutions.
Yeah, I would completely agree with that. I would add, though, that not only is the industry not ready for the deprecation of cookies, I do think that majority of the industry is not prepared either. Maybe some of the holding companies are, maybe some of the larger publishers are, but widespread, I do not think the rest of the industry is ready. I also don't think that privacy sandbox in itself covers enough or will be able to provide support the same level of use cases that we currently have and that is a big concern and challenge. What I would love to see is having them. They've started to roll out their API, but provide more time for companies to adopt those APIs, test them out, and give them time to change their algorithms, change their models to support it, and continue to get feedback until perhaps later on down the line, maybe a year further, when we can actually get more adoption. But we need to force advertisers and publishers to adopt these changes, and having them depend on cookies until it drops is not the right answer. So you have to do it simultaneously.
I think greater flexibility in Sandbox for marketers, right?
Yeah.
Sandbox is sort of a one size fits all solution for everybody, though we've already seen the taxonomy is somewhat limited, and doesn't meet all of the custom requirements of all marketers. So embedding more flexibility to define the kind of segments that advertisers want to target will be a key part of adoption.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm wondering on the timeline piece, Angie, that you mentioned, maybe, if there was another year on the timeline, that maybe we could get to a place where preparedness is really solid. I'm wondering if the UK's Competition and Markets Authority, knowing that they are very closely monitoring how the rollout of Privacy Sandbox goes, what will go on there. It seems like I've read the kind of guidelines that they put out, like soliciting feedback from the advertising industry about how their tests go, and whether this is actually a suitable replacement for the infrastructure that upheld the system beforehand. So very interesting space to watch. We'll see how it goes. I want to circle back to AI, obviously, and because there are products hitting the market, it seems like daily, or at least it feels like that, that kind of leverage AI to help fill addressability gaps. And we've talked about this a little bit before, but what we haven't really broached into is how marketers can balance that efficiency, the use of AI-driven advertising technologies, while simultaneously prioritizing consumer privacy and data protection. It's a thorny issue, but it kind of has to be discussed. So let's discuss it.
Ooh, I'll have Ian go first.
Yeah, it's just that there's so many different kind of angles and avenues here in terms of considering like how to ensure that there's kind of no bias in your models, because one of the things you have to be cognizant of is that ultimately our model is going to kind of replicate the data it's been kind of trained with. So if you do kind of introduce these kind of biases that are kind of there, and how there's obviously kind of like trends that are emerging now where we're seeing far more interest and work happening on edge computing, where you're splitting actually the intelligence between what might happen on the kind of the server side versus on the device, and then trying to kind of shift aspects of that to kind of preserve privacy in that kind of a greater manner that's kind of there. But it's a kind of a complex area. I think there's obviously from an advertiser point of view as well, how you use AI. I think the transparency is going to be kind of like a key aspect here, because I think there are things now where in the past it was like, well, AI can't produce something that would pass for real, whereas now it can. And so suddenly it really is a kind of a much bigger issue. And I think that arguably perhaps people just in the industry maybe is a little bit complacent, because we saw some of the early kind of like, if I think about image as an example, image generation, I wind the clock back kind of like a year, the quality of the output that was there versus where it is now. And you see these kind of things coming out from kind of like Midjourney and kind of DALL-E. It's just like, oh my God, this is like photorealistic. And suddenly these aspects now where a consumer might not necessarily realize kind of what's kind of going on there. So I think there's needs to be thought given to kind of considering how you should kind of communicate what's actually happening so that kind of user is aware of what's going on.
I think it was Sam Altman of OpenAI who said essentially that it's going to be impossible to pull user private information that they've shared into the system out of the system. So data subject rights execution will be virtually impossible in the AI world. But I think what we'll see is ultimately AI is driven by the inputs that you put into the system. It's a ultimately a garbage in, garbage out kind of system at the end of the day, which also means you can control what goes into the system and what doesn't at some level. So I think there's going to be certainly very clear lines drawn on what kind of information can be fed into these models and what can't. And I don't think it's going to differ too much from what we already call sensitive personal information. So things like credit scores and that kind of information will be strictly off limits for AI models to use. But at the same time, AI is very, or can be at least, very personalized. So what a user feeds in, they shouldn't be surprised to see responses from AI, come back to them incorporating that information.
We wrote a paper last year, or a year and a half ago. Time flies, and and it was how to minimize bias in AI for advertising. And one of the things that, and this paper was geared towards everyone in the marketplace, and discussing what their role and responsibility is when it comes to AI, from marketers, C-level executives, engineers, designers, and even the end users that are using the data. And one of the things that we talked about and we stress in the paper is that you're not going to be able to remove bias at all, right? So there will be some bias to some degree within the data set. That's just natural. But I think that what we need to think about what our responsibilities are in terms of what are the data that we input into the system. So it's very easy to say, let's just, why don't we just upload a bunch of PII data along with their behavior, their interests, how they react to an ad, what their purchase habits are. I would caution companies to be very careful in doing that, and leverage aggregate data, insert some noise into that data set, so that at least from an ethical standpoint and from a responsible standpoint, you're not putting in too much information that could potentially be stitched back to an identifying user.
Okay,
Even there, you still have the bias, right?
Yeah.
Any aggregate sort of statistics that mirror popularly held stereotypes may very well be reflected in the decisions AI makes, and that will reinforce bias. And that's going to be tricky to navigate.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's a lot of, for all of its potential benefits, there is risk in this technology. So it's definitely something that, the marketing industry at large and every individual kind of entity within it needs to keep an eye on as we embark on this kind of new era. All right, so that was an excellent discussion. And it's time to tackle some audience questions. And we've had some good ones so far. So any of our audience members out there, please keep them coming if anything sparks your interest. And actually, we can kind of lean into this. We were just talking about transparency in leveraging AI tech and how to maintain kind of a positive relationship with maybe some skeptical or even creeped out consumers. So what are some more steps that advertisers can take to help ensure that transparency, not just in terms of their relationship with their consumers, but also in the AI algorithms themselves that can help then reinforce trust with consumers as we embark on this journey?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of companies. If I look almost somewhat broader as well, just the theme of kind of AI and kind of consumer applications as well as advertising, and people are publishing in effect the data that there's kind of using to say this is why you would see this, and to try and kind of like unpick that. And we've had this kind of interesting well, interesting for nerds like myself, but the point where we've had these kind of black box systems with these kind of like neural networks, which we'd be like, oh, okay, that's the output. Okay, we don't really kind of know why. To now having far more effort and focus on the kind of explainability. But I think that just the transparency around, hey, this is the information we collect. This is kind of like how it's used, and this is kind of why you saw that. And we actually use a lot of these tools internally as well, just to try and say, well, this was the output from some particular model. Why was that? And so having that, but that information can actually be shared, and so people can kind of dip in and try and understand, well, why am I seeing this? What did I do that would mean that this was the kind of the experience that I got in that way? So I think that there's more work happening around trying to sort of like just share that type of knowledge with kind of like consumers.
I think also giving consumers the control of that data. We have all these, the browsers have their preference settings, their privacy settings, but Chrome and Microsoft will continue to evolve that and provide right now, like with topics. I think you can see or potentially see what the topics that it rolls up. But at the same time, I think both publishers and advertisers, need to provide a dashboard of some sort that shows exactly what data they've collected about the user, how it's being used, who it's being used with, as well as what are some of the inferred data that they're ascertaining from it. So based on this habit, we believe you're a soccer mom, right? And soccer
I
mom
agree with
defines
the disclosure of what data you bring in. It's going to be harder to provide what you might call an AI nutrition label around why you were served a given ad, largely because you have multiple constituents along that value chain that are going to be leveraging AI in their own way. So you might have an SSP or a publisher uses one logic for surfacing a ad impression to buyers, and buyers are using their own logic, their own AI to bid on it. And it's going to take either a tremendous amount of collaboration to transparently surface how all of these different algorithms interplayed to result in the showing of an ad to make that happen. So I see that being a long way off and a lot of collaboration needed to really, say this is why you were given a certain ad. So I don't hold a lot of hope that we're going to have a viable nutrition label anytime in the near future.
That is kind of scary a little bit, as I sometimes like to put on my consumer hat in these conversations and like interrogate how I personally feel about those things. It's pretty scary. Maybe one day we'll be able to kind of feed all of those, all of the kind of different AI use cases into an LLM that can like spit out something that's interpretable to the average person of what's going on. I don't know. But certainly eager to see how it all unfolds. All right, we have time for one final question here. And I think it's appropriate to end on brand safety. There's a lot of kind of, current events in our world that maybe would pique someone's interest around the brand safety conversation. And let's tie in AI, why don't we? How will AI be used to measure or optimize for brand safety? And how does that differ from the way that the industry approaches that today?
Just to start, just purely from a technology perspective, what's happened over this kind of last sort of like year, obviously we've always had this kind of improvement each year in terms of like models get better and better each time, but now the actual kind of like in the early stages, if you were looking for say something that was like you do some skin detection, looking for some kind of like adult material, really kind of rudimentary basic, now these algorithms are so sophisticated you can actually like pass through kind of videos and you can start to kind of understand the tone of what's actually being talked about, not just kind of like trying to pick out kind of keywords. So the automation is and the sophistication, is almost like at this completely different level. So this really should kind of help us in terms of trying to make sure we have kind of great safety there. But I'll let the others speak more about it, but just really want to make that one point to say how much the technology has advanced in being able to kind of assist us in this.
So I know right now, especially from the brand safety side, there are some, not perfect, some capabilities of using AI right now where, let's just say a DSP or a contextual targeting company is evaluating all the meta tags and all the context that's coming directly from a publisher's site, and including some of the signals that of how they're classifying the content. But they're also taking LLM and reevaluating the content on that page, including understanding tone and sentiment, and reclassifying some of that content. So it's already being done. We're also looking at taking one thing that we've been working with is, on the IAB Tech Lab side and IAB side is looking at podcasts and audio and being able to take the transcript from those and then applying some logic to it for ad verification, and not just the keywords that are being said, but using AI to understand the context, again, context and tone and the purpose of those podcasts.
I can also throw in a little teaser here and sales pitch for the future, which is October 17th in Ad Week. We're going to be having a panel in collaboration with Human, one of our partners in the brand safety arena, who will be able to go into a great deal of depth on how they are looking into the problem of brand safety. So I'll throw that teaser out there.
I'd love to see AI help publishers in when they're publishing content to identify if there's any challenges or issues with the way that they're passing through the signals, as well as providing them some flags about potential blocking of ads on their content. So if there was something that actually looked at their content before they uploaded and came back with a score of some sort that said, hey, the likelihood of you winning a bid is X%, or these types of advertisers are more likely to not serve ads on your page due to the following, and help them rewrite or reevaluate what some of the changes they should be making to their content. I know that's a very sensitive topic because you want to try and separate editorial from advertising, but hey, this is reality, right? So
it's like reverse brand safety.
Yes, exactly. That's what I'd love to see.
Yeah. Well, interesting. Maybe we'll see some of that develop in the future. And I will also, to Todd's point, be at the event on October 17th. I'm really excited. I think we're going to have another really excellent conversation about all of these things. These are hot topics, and we can barely stop talking about them these days. And unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. Thanks again to Amy, Angelina, Ian, and Todd for joining us. And a very special thanks to the team at InMobi. And Studio II, our eMarketer production crew behind the scenes, also deserves a huge thank you for making this webinar possible. We couldn't do it without them, literally. As promised, we will be emailing you a link to the full recording of today's discussion, so keep an eye out on your inbox for that. And before we wrap up, let me take a moment to tell you what's happening across eMarketer's media channels. You can register for upcoming live Analyst and Tech Talk webinars at emarketer.com/webinars. On the audio side, don't forget to tune into Behind the Numbers, eMarketer's daily podcast, which you can find anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And finally, please check out our newsletters. We have a couple of options across retail, finance, and digital advertising, so there's something for everyone. And if you haven't already signed up, you can do so at emarketer.com/newsletters. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your workday.